People often say, a marriage doesn't fall apart in a single moment. It falls apart in hundreds of small moments that you ignored. I've stayed silent long enough. And today, at 64, I know I can't run from the truth for one more day. You know, everyone thinks I'm lucky. Everyone believes I live in paradise with the smartest, most beautiful, most perfect woman they've ever seen on a magazine cover, Amal Clooney. If you're hanging on to any kind of vanity. But no one knows this. My paradise has a lock, and I'm the one trapped inside. And the biggest question, the one that's crushed me for the past 5 years. What happens to a marriage when the woman's mind is too bright and the man's heart is too tired? Many times I've asked myself, am I really such a poor excuse for a man? When I feel small, unneeded in my own life, whose fault is that? Hers? Mine? Or the fault of this so-called perfect couple image that everyone forces you to become? I know you're wondering. I know you want the answer, and you'll get it right now. I still remember the night of September 28, 2013 so clearly. The night that, if I could choose again, I might have walked out of that room before she even saw me. Lake Como was so peaceful that night. I thought nothing could ever change my life again. I was 52 years old, had loved, had been broken, and had sworn never to get married. I believed my life was already set. A villa by the lake, a few close friends, and just enough films to help me escape the noise of Hollywood. I was so used to freedom, the kind of freedom I thought no one could ever take from me. But then Amal walked in. She wasn't like anyone I had ever met. Not a celebrity, not someone trying to impress me. She walked into the room with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen things most of us never dare to face. What stunned me wasn't her beauty, though I'll admit I was speechless for a few seconds. What left me breathless was the way she looked at me. Not with admiration, not nervously, not with that "oh my god, it's George Clooney" kind of look, but with the look of someone who sees you as a difficult question, one she's not sure she wants to answer. We talked for hours about war, international law, about children who had lost their families in Syria. I had never been so quiet in my life. I was used to being the storyteller, the one in control, the one people paid attention to. But with Amal, for the first time, I felt small. And for some reason, I like that feeling. In the weeks that followed, we talked on the phone every night. She made me laugh, made me think, made me nervous because I sometimes couldn't keep up with her mind. I flew around the world to see her whenever I could. Amal made me want to be a better version of myself, and I believed that was love. But that love came too fast, too strong, too blind. We met again and again, and within just a few months, I felt like I no longer belonged to my old world. She made me want to be better, deeper, smarter. But today, looking back, I realized what I thought was motivation was really fear. Fear of falling behind. I didn't love like a man with life experience. I loved like someone trying to prove something. And that was my first mistake. In April 2014, I proposed to her in my kitchen. I still remember how her eyes went wide, so surprised she couldn't say a word for 20 minutes. I thought that was happiness. But today I wonder, was that really happiness or a warning I refused to hear? Our wedding in Venice. The press called it the wedding of the century. I smiled, held her hand, played the role of the perfect man. I played it well because the whole world wanted to believe it. But it wasn't until the honeymoon suite door closed behind us that I faced a truth I had never dared to say out loud. I was afraid. Not afraid of marriage, not afraid of responsibility. I was afraid of Amal, or more precisely, afraid of not being enough. Afraid I couldn't match her brilliance or her extraordinary presence. Afraid that one day she'd realize I wasn't as deep, as sharp, or as exceptional as the world claimed I was. Afraid she'd see me for what I was. Just an actor, a great storyteller, but not good enough for her life. In the first months after the wedding, I tried to become the man she needed. I studied international law, followed war news more than film news, tried to step into the intellectual world Amal lived in. But the harder I tried, the more I felt like I was slipping out of my own life. I laughed less, felt less natural. Every sentence I spoke had to be deep enough, accurate enough, intellectual enough. And then I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. I no longer knew who I was when I stood next to her. I hadn't married a woman. I had married someone who made me question my own worth every single day. And that's when the tragedy truly began. I don't know the exact moment when everything started to break. People always ask me, George, what was the day you realized your marriage wasn't what the world imagined? But the truth is, there was no specific day. Pain is not an explosion. It is a crack. A tiny crack. A quiet crack. A crack that grows in ways even you don't understand, until you are no longer yourself. A crack that spreads until one morning you look in the mirror and realize the eyes staring back at you no longer belong to the man the world once knew as George Clooney. After the wedding, Amal didn't change. She was still brilliant, sharp, determined, praised around the world as a symbol of intellect. I was the one who changed. I changed to keep up with her. I changed so I wouldn't disappoint her. I changed so I wouldn't be left behind. But with every attempt, I felt myself drifting further away from my own soul. And the cruelest part is that Amal never asked me to change. She never said, "Be like me." She never asked me to read hundreds of pages of international security documents every night. She never forced me into debates about war crimes I didn't understand. She never said the words, but her eyes were enough to pull me into a race I could never win. One night in November 2014, Amal was reading a United Nations report in the living room. I walked in holding a glass of wine, thinking we could watch a movie to end the long day, but she didn't look up. She didn't hear my footsteps. I stood there for nearly 2 minutes like an uninvited guest in my own home. When I finally tried to say something to break the silence, she answered in a flat voice. "Could you walk more quietly? I'm reading testimonies from torture victims." I froze. There was no malice in her words, but they went straight through me. I wanted to share a life with her, but she had no space for anything light. No movies, no small talk, no relaxing evenings, no laughter. Only work, only human rights, only war, only the suffering of the world. A world I was never deep enough to truly grasp. And every time I tried to step into her world, I felt lost. She never said it, but I knew I didn't belong there. People think Amal is a saint, that she is kind, brilliant, perfect, and she is all of that. But no one can live beside a saint without feeling full of guilt. She had no idea how I felt. Or maybe she did and simply didn't care. I started to feel beneath her, not in terms of respect, but in the everyday moments of our life. When we went out for dinner, she was the one people wanted to meet. Not George Clooney, but Amal Clooney, global symbol of intellect. I used to be the center of every room, but now all eyes turned to her. I loved her, but I was also jealous of her. Not jealous of her achievements, but jealous of the invisible power she carried in every conversation, every room we entered. I started drinking more. A glass of wine in the evening, then 2, then 3. Not to forget sadness, but to forget the feeling that I was losing. I, who once stood on global stages, once seen as the most charming man in the world, suddenly felt like a shadow behind the woman I married. She said something I will never forget. One evening in March 2015, we were debating a major news story. She said, "George, do you ever think one step deeper?" Those words were like a knife. No shouting, no insult. But they made me understand something cruel. In her eyes, I was shallow. Not stupid, but not deep enough. Not enough to be the husband of Amal Clooney. She never said, "You don't deserve me." But I heard it in every silence. There were nights when she lay reading a 300-page report while I sat beside her, silent, unsure whether I should ask a question or quietly disappear into another corner of the house. I felt like an actor failing an audition in the real-life version of my own story. And then the worst thing happened. I started to fear talking to my own wife. I was afraid of saying something stupid, afraid of not being intellectual enough, afraid of being seen as shallow, afraid of being judged with the kind of eyes she never used on her fellow lawyers. Do you know where the deepest humiliation for a man lies? Not in being betrayed, not in being left behind, but in being seen by the woman he loves as someone not worthy enough to stand beside her. Give me a number 1 if you feel the same. Someone once asked me, "George, did she ever try to understand you?" I don't want to say this, but the truth is, Amal loved me, but she didn't understand me and she didn't need to. She lived in a world of war crime cases, international speeches, and victim statistics. I was never strong enough to carry alongside her. I don't blame her. But I resent the feeling that I was just an ordinary man who married an extraordinary woman and was crushed by that very extraordinariness. On nights when I stood on the balcony looking down at the lake, a glass of wine in my hand, I asked myself one question. "George, whose life are you living?" And the most painful answer was, "Not mine." And that's when love began to die. Silence. That's what kills a marriage the fastest. Not shouting, not insults, not explosive jealousy like in the movies. It's the silence. Silence so loud you can hear your heart cracking into pieces. After the cage of intellect closed around me, our marriage entered a phase I still call the silent battlefield. No one fired shots, no one yelled, no one stormed out in tears. We just stopped talking. Or worse, when we did talk, it was only out of duty, not out of connection. People thought Amal and I were the most powerful couple in the world. Time magazine listed her among the 100 most influential people on the planet. The press called her the woman who made George Clooney change. And there I was, standing next to her, smiling, perfectly groomed in a tuxedo. But deep down, it felt like I was behind thick glass, watching my life unfold without being able to touch it. One evening in 2016, we attended a charity gala in London. I watched her walk into the room as if she were the center of the world's axis. Black hair, graceful posture, sharp eyes. People couldn't take their eyes off her. Politicians rushed to greet her. International lawyers welcomed her like a head of state. And me? I felt like the plus one. No one said it, but I knew in that room I was no longer George Clooney. I was Amal Clooney's husband. Back at the hotel, I tried to talk about the gala, the people I had met. Amal listened briefly, then quickly shifted to the topic of the war in Syria. She spoke about a report she was preparing. I wanted to share, wanted to understand, but my mind felt heavy. She spoke fast, spoke deep, spoke in a language I had tried to learn but never became fluent in. I just sat there nodding slightly, feeling empty inside. And then she looked at me, a flicker of disappointment in her eyes. No words, no blame, just disappointment. A look that can crush your heart more than any words ever could. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling and asked myself, where did I go? But that wasn't the only time. One morning in 2017, after we had just had our twins, Amal was so busy that everything became a checklist. I didn't blame her. She's the strongest woman I've ever known. But there were moments when it became painfully clear our marriage was no longer a place where we could breathe. I remember the time I said, "Can we spend 30 minutes together tonight?" She just replied, "I'll try if I finish the call with the UN. I just want to talk a little," I said. She looked at me calmly and said, "George, we have our whole lives to talk. Right now, I'm saving lives out there." I didn't say another word, because how could a man like me compare to the people out there? How could the voice inside me compete with the cries of war victims? She was right, but the most painful truths are often the ones that hurt a marriage the most. Little by little, I stopped sharing anything with her. If I was happy, I stayed silent. If I was sad, I stayed silent. If I missed her, I stayed silent. If I felt crushed under the weight of my own inadequacy, I became even more silent. That was the silent battlefield I fell into night after night. The worst part was, Amal didn't notice. Or maybe she did, but didn't have the time to care. I remember the most brutal moment in 2018. I was telling her about a film I was producing. She looked up from her laptop for exactly 3 seconds and said, "Oh, good. I'm happy for you." Then went right back to typing. I stood there with a forced smile, swallowing a pain that even I found ridiculous. I wanted to scream, "I have a life too." But I didn't scream because I knew in this house the things I thought were important actually meant nothing. There were nights I stood alone on the balcony, glass of wine in hand, staring down at the lake as dark as a shattered mirror. The wind blew cold, so cold it made me shiver, but not as cold as the growing distance between us. Amal slept in the room next door, and I stood outside trying to find some trace of George Clooney, the actor, the man once adored by the world. But all I saw was the shadow of myself. People ask, "George, did Amal control you?" No, she didn't control me in the usual way. She didn't check my phone. She didn't call me 20 times a day. She wasn't blindly jealous. But there's a more subtle kind of control, the kind that comes from absolute superiority. Do you know what it feels like to shrink every time the other person walks into the room? The feeling that everything you say is too shallow, too simple, too small. The feeling of having to think 5 times before saying anything, afraid it won't be deep enough? That's invisible control, but it slowly suffocates you day by day, hour by hour. We still appeared in public like the dream couple. One of her arms linked with mine, one of my hands gently holding her under the flash of cameras. But when the lights went out, when we got home, we sat in separate corners. No one spoke, no one touched. The other, no one dared to say what they feared most. I was afraid to say I felt lonely. She was afraid to admit she no longer knew how to be a wife. We were afraid of each other. The cruelest part of this tragedy is there was no villain. There was no one to blame, just 2 people drowning in their own silence. One night, I walked into Amal's office without knocking. I wanted to hug her from behind, to feel something, anything from the early days. When I touched her shoulder, she flinched slightly and turned around. "George, please don't distract me." Just one sentence, but that blow hit harder than any punch I ever took on a movie set. From that night on, I stopped touching her when she was working. And Amal was always working. I know my marriage didn't die from a lack of love. It died from a lack of space for love to exist. It died because I was no longer the man who could make her laugh. It died because she was no longer the woman I could open up to. It died because between us stood 2 worlds, and no bridge could connect them. I once whispered to her, "We used to be so happy." She gave a faint smile. I remember that too. And in her eyes, I saw something that haunted me for years. It was the kind of longing you feel for something that's already dead. That was the moment I understood. Love doesn't disappear in one night. It dies from starvation. I, a man who once made the whole world laugh, couldn't make my own wife smile for months. And that was when hell truly began. People often say a marriage doesn't fall apart in a single moment. It falls apart in hundreds of small moments you ignored. But for me, there was a moment that ended it all. A moment that even now, every time I think about it, makes my chest feel like it's being crushed. It happened in the fall of 2019. I was filming a project in London, and Amal was working nearly 20 hours a day on a major human rights case. That night, I came home earlier than expected. I was hoping to see her, to hear her voice, to simply be in the same room and not feel like we belonged to separate worlds. But when I stepped into the house, what I heard was silence. A silence so deep I thought I had walked into an empty home. I took off my jacket, placed my keys on the table, and went looking for her. I found her in the office. A dim desk lamp lit the space, her laptop open, papers piled high. She was there, but not really there. Her face was tense, hair pulled back in a hurry. Her eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who'd lived too long without sleep. I stood in the doorway. "Are you okay?" She didn't turn around. "I'm fine." One word, just one word. But it was cold as ice. I walked into the room and placed my hand gently on her back. "You've been working since morning. Can you take a break? I just want to talk." She should have leaned into me like she used to, but she didn't. She shifted slightly as if my touch distracted her. Then she said the sentence I'll never forget. "George, please let me finish this. This isn't the time." I stood there, hollow. Not because of the words, but because of how she said them. No anger, no frustration, just distance. As if I were a stranger, as if my presence no longer meant anything in her life. I quietly left the room, but then I stopped. For the first time in years, I felt like I couldn't take it anymore. I turned back, stood in the doorway, and looked straight at her. "We can't keep doing this." She still didn't look up. "George, don't start this right now." "Right now?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Amal, when is the right time? You're busy from morning to night. You work every single day. You've disappeared from this marriage without even saying sorry. Do you even realize that?" Finally, she looked up at me. Her eyes weren't angry. They weren't sad either. They were just surprised, as if she had just been reminded that I still existed. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. "Give everything up?" "No," I said. "I just want you to look at me. Just once. Look at how much I'm hurting." Silence. In that moment, I realized silence wasn't just a gap. It was an answer I didn't want to hear. I continued. "I love you, but I don't know if you still love me. I feel like a guest in my own marriage." She looked down at the table. "I'm sorry you feel that way." "Amal," I said softly, but sharp as a blade. "That's not an apology. That's just a sentence." She sighed. "George, my work is important. It involves people's lives. I can't always prioritize your feelings." And that was when everything broke. Not because she was wrong, she was right. But love sometimes dies, not because someone's wrong, but because one person hurts for too long, the other is too busy for too long, and both stop meeting in the middle. I looked at her deeply and said, "I'm not asking you to give up the world, but you gave up us." She pressed her lips together. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Then she snapped back, "That's not fair." "Not fair?" I laughed bitterly. "You know what's more unfair? That I have to beg you to spend time with me like I'm just another entry in your schedule? George, no. Let me finish." I cut her off. "I'm tired. Not of your work, but of the way you no longer look at me like the man you once chose." At that moment, I saw her eyes glisten slightly, but the tears didn't fall. Amal isn't the kind of woman who cries from pain. She just gets colder. "I'm sorry," she said, "if I'm not enough for you." Not enough? On the contrary, she was too much. Too strong, too extraordinary. So much that there was no room left for me to be myself. I took a deep breath. I don't want to lose you, but I also can't keep going like this. When I said that, she closed her eyes, as if her heart had just been gripped by something she couldn't stop. And then the last thing I ever expected happened. She spoke softly, her voice slightly shaking. "I don't know how to be a wife, George." I stood frozen. That sentence, it felt like a knife through me, but also like a confession buried for years. "I never learned how to be a wife," she continued. "I only know how to be a warrior." I stepped closer to her. "I don't need a warrior. I need a partner." She didn't respond. I don't know how long I stood there just listening to the clock ticking. Tick, tock, like it was counting down the seconds of something breaking apart. Finally, Amal stood up, closed her laptop, and said, "We need time." Those two words felt like a bomb going off inside me. Because when the woman you love says we need time, what she really means is half her heart is already gone. That night, I went downstairs and sat alone in the dark. No TV, no wine, no sound. Just me and my shadow. It felt like I had finally lost the woman I loved most. But the crueler truth was, I had also lost myself. The days that followed were tense. We lived in the same house, but like two strangers. Amal slept in a separate room, saying it was so she wouldn't wake me while working late. But we both knew that was just an excuse, a way to avoid facing what was really happening. One morning, I saw her suitcase near the door. I didn't ask. She didn't explain. Everything was already painfully clear. As she walked out, she said only, "I'll be staying with my mother for a few days." But I knew a few days is never just a few days. It's the beginning of retreat, the beginning of goodbye. When the door shut behind her, the house fell silent like the air had been sucked out. I sat down on the stairs and buried my face in my hands. That was the moment I knew my marriage couldn't be saved. Not because there wasn't love, but because we were both too exhausted to keep loving. And yet, the real tragedy was still waiting ahead. Give me a number 5 if you've got the strength to keep going with me. On October 17, 2019, at exactly 6:42 p.m., Amal closed the door and walked out of our London home. Her silver Rimowa suitcase rolled across the marble floor, making a cold, hollow sound like the period at the end of everything. I stood just a few feet away from her, but the distance between us felt wider than the sky over Lake Como in winter. The door shut at 6:43, and I knew I had just witnessed the moment our love took its last breath. That night, at 10:15 p.m., sitting alone in the unlit living room, I realized the silence in the house had changed. It was no longer the silence of psychological warfare. It was the silence of a place that had lost its owner. Amal's chair was still there. Her favorite pillow still carried a faint trace of her perfume, but she was gone. I opened my phone and saw dozens of emails from the press. Daily Mail, The Sun, Page 6, asking, "George, is the separation rumor true?" I deleted each one. I couldn't lie, but I didn't have the strength to tell the truth either. On October 22, 2019, I received the first message from Amal since she left. "I need more time. No, I miss you. No, I'm coming back. Just time." I read that message more than 20 times, and with every read, my heart sank deeper into the cracks our marriage had left behind. By November 2019, I went to Lake Como alone. I stayed at the villa. On November 4th, at the same place where more than 6 years earlier, Amal once told me the words that froze me in place. "I've never met anyone who understands me the way you do." Now, standing by the vast lake, I heard the wind whistling through the trees, as if it were reminding me that even the most sacred promises have an expiration date. I stood there for nearly an hour, freezing, and asked myself, when did I lose her? Was it July 2017 when she told me I didn't understand her world? Was it March 2018 when I asked for 30 minutes to talk and she said, "Maybe when I'm free"? Or was it the night of September 21st, 2019, the night I touched her shoulder and she said, "Please don't distract me"? On December 2nd, 2019, I returned to London to see her one last time, to talk. It was lightly raining. The clock read 8:12 p.m. when she walked into the living room, damp and cold, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders. She didn't look like the strong Amal the world knew. She looked like a woman exhausted from trying to balance everything. Her first words came at 8:15. "I've been thinking a lot." I replied, "So have I." She said, "We're not the same anymore." Her voice trembled, not with anger, but with fear of saying what needed to be said. I waited in silence. At 8:17, she continued, "Maybe we should spend some time apart." In that moment, I heard a sound most people never hear. The sound of your heart cracking into 100 pieces. On January 18th, 2020, the media began reporting Clooney, Amal facing serious issues. At 7:50 p.m., I sat in front of the TV watching my own name appear on CNN. I didn't turn it off. I just watched. I felt like I was watching a film where I was the main character but had no control over the script. On February 14th, 2020, my first Valentine's Day without Amal, I realized something. The scariest part wasn't that she was no longer there. The scariest part was that I was starting to get used to her not being there. Then came March 2020, and the whole world shut down because of the pandemic. I was home in Los Angeles, alone in a house far too big for one person. During those days, I felt Amal's absence more clearly than ever. I cooked alone, watched TV alone, drank alone, slept alone. The loneliness of the pandemic magnified the loneliness of our marriage into something unbearable. On June 9th, 2020, Amal and I had our first Zoom call in months. It wasn't about emotions, it was to discuss where the kids would stay. She spoke reasonably, calmly, intelligently, but not a single word touched my heart. When the call ended, I looked at the blank screen and saw my reflection. Older, more tired, and completely empty. By August 2021, I decided to stay in Lake Como longer. I tried writing. I tried meditating. I tried finding a way to forgive myself. I saw friends. I laughed. But in the moments no one was watching, I felt like a man quietly sorting through the ruins of his old life. On January 3rd, 2022, I received a handwritten letter from Amal, 2 pages long. She wrote, "I'm sorry I didn't know how to love you the way you needed, and I don't regret us. I just fear that if we try to save it, we'll only end up hurting each other more." I read that letter at 10:03 a.m., sunlight from the new year pouring in through the window. I knew this was the final moment, the moment I had to let go. After January 7th, 2022, when Amal and I officially signed the separation documents, I returned to Lake Como and spent the first year of my new life more quietly than any time in my 3 decades as an actor. In those early months of 2022, I started waking up earlier, around 6 a.m., and sitting in silence by the still lake. I no longer had to answer interviews about our beautiful family life. I no longer had to play the part of the perfect husband. But there was also no one left to ask if I slept well, if I'd eaten breakfast, if I was tired. In April 2022, I accepted the role in Ticket to Paradise with Julia Roberts. People thought I was excited to return, but the truth is, I just needed to run away from a villa that had become too quiet. On set in Queensland, Australia, I kept everyone laughing. But when the lights went down, I often sat alone in the makeup room, looking into the mirror and seeing a man aging faster than his 61 years. One day, Julia asked, "George, are you really okay?" I smiled. Not completely, but I'm living. That was the truest thing I could say. From September to December 2022, I spent most of my time in Los Angeles taking care of the twins. I tried to be a more present father. I took them to school, to swim lessons, told them bedtime stories. When they asked, "Why isn't mommy here?" I simply said, "Mommy's doing something good for the world." I never said anything that would make them think their mother was wrong. I didn't want to repeat the toxic cycles so many Hollywood kids have had to grow up with. In 2023, I started working less. Not because the roles stopped coming, but because I wanted to slow down. I was still producing films, still writing, still showing up at events for Not on Our Watch. But I turned down a lot of big projects. On March 5th, 2023, when I received the Lifetime Achievement Award at the Hollywood Humanitarian Honors event, I stood on stage and realized Amal was no longer in the audience. She used to be there in 2015, 2016, 2018, but that year, there was only an empty chair. I didn't cry. But in that moment, I understood that I had traded a marriage for 2 people who belonged to 2 very different missions. I belonged to the screen. Amal belonged to the battlefield of justice. And sometimes love just isn't enough to merge 2 separate worlds into one. In the summer of 2023, I took the kids to Lake Como for 2 months. I realized I laughed more when I was with them. Every evening, I made myself a Negroni, sat out on the porch, and watched the lake change colors as the sun set at 8:45 p.m. I no longer felt the pressure to be the perfect man like I did when I was with Amal. I wasn't being judged, wasn't watched for every word I said. I just got to be myself. But on some nights, when the house was quiet, I'd open the small box where I kept Amal's handwritten letter from January 3rd, 2022. The letter where she said she didn't know how to be a wife, that she was afraid of hurting me more. Every time I read it, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel regret. I felt something else, a kind of beautiful sadness. The sadness of something that was once so right and simply isn't anymore. As 2024 began, I started appearing on talk shows again. I was on with Jimmy Kimmel in February 2024. When Jimmy jokingly asked, "George, do you love the single life?" I answered, "Freedom is sometimes lonely, but I'm learning how to live with it." The audience laughed, but deep down, I knew I was only telling half the truth. Today, I'm 63. My life is quieter, less pressured, but also more empty. I write more scripts. I spend more time with my kids, and I'm learning to accept that love doesn't always end with a slammed door. Sometimes it ends with a whisper. We just can't find each other anymore. If you've made it this far, one thing is certain. You're not just curious about George Clooney. You're also asking yourself what truly kills a marriage that once seemed perfect. I want to hear your answer. Leave just one line in the comments. Type 4 for intellect, 2 for silence.